And good evening, everyone. This is Lloyd, and I am back with Eric and Connie. And their links are in the description, so please go visit their channels. There's some great content. Connie puts out small clips. Eric puts out some great discussions, some really interesting talks, interesting people, interesting topics. And I've got him here to talk about the preservation of the Gospels today. So, how are you two doing? Thanks for coming today.
Great. Thanks for the invitation.
Yep. Thanks for having us again, Lloyd.
No, you're very welcome. I mean, I'd like to bring you on semi-regularly. I really enjoyed the last conversation, and I do follow some of your content. There's so much on YouTube, I can't watch everything, but I certainly do watch some of your content. Like one guy I would love to trap in a dark alley with an audience and a spotlight and have a little sit-down conversation with is Paul Williams. I I've watched your show on Paul Williams. That guy, slippery, liar, and will never ever meet with someone who actually knows what they're talking about.
Agree 100%. We did a show on him. I think we mentioned this the last time we were
I
here.
watched it, yeah.
Yeah. And the guy is just, it's so, if he wasn't so, if the problem would not be if he did not know he was lying, if he did not know he was misrepresenting, whether it was the gospel or the information that he puts out on his channel, it really wouldn't be a problem because I can accept ignorance. You can accept people just being ignorant of things. But see, the problem is that he knows that he's lying about it. And when you know that you're lying about something and you still try to present it as facts, that's when it becomes very problematic. And that's what he does.
Yeah, they lose credibility. I mean, because I'll be the first one to stand myself corrected. I was corrected the other day by a Muslim. I said it. I stand corrected.
I've tagged him at least a dozen times. I mean, I've tagged him over and over. I have left him messages. He just will not engage with me. So, yeah. So Eric, over to you. Today, the topic is gospel preservation. Why this particular topic?
Well, the reason why I think this for Christians to know how well their gospel has been preserved is because of the constant attacks from Dawagandists, from Muslims, saying that the gospel has been corrupted. The gospels have been corrupted to the point where we don't even know who the authors were. The original message of Jesus is contained in this fictitious Disneyland book called the Injil, is not what was presented in the first century, and that everything that is in the gospel has either been confirmed by the Quran or has been rectified by the Quran, and all of it is a lie. So I think that if Christians just know a certain number of facts that pertain to the authorship of the Gospels, they'll be better equipped to take on these charges, or at least, and this is always my goal on my show, is the edification of their faith, is to strengthen their faith in what we have, knowing that this story that we have in the gospel message is a story that you can trust, and you can take that, you can enjoy that blessed assurance that Christ provides you, and knowing what the gospel message teaches, that, and knowing, not believing, but knowing in its veracity and its truthfulness, just gives you this overwhelming peace, especially when dealing with the Paul Williamses of the world and his ilk.
I'm going to take a moment. So Sergeant Grinch, guys, please, Sergeant Grinch has been a long-time supporter of the channel. Please take a moment to keep him in your prayers for his treatment, that things go well, and his illness goes into remission, and he becomes healthy and stays healthy. So thanks, Sergeant Grinch. Good to know you're well, and yeah, all the best. We wish you the best, and speedy recovery.
Yeah, man. And that leukemia piece, that's a tough. I had a friend of mine. He had leukemia, and he had it for 15 years, 20. No, not I know, 15 years, and it was just was just hard watching people
My dad died during COVID of
do those
yeah,
things.
it was, and I couldn't fly home. I couldn't get home. And it was horrific, but it happened so fast. But it was really torturous. So,
Yeah.
yeah, but let's think positive thoughts.
Sorry to
Let's
hear that, sir.
yeah, it
God
was
rest
quite
him.
traumatic actually. But thank you.
I'm sure it's your father. I lost my father about 5 years ago as well. Healthy
Yeah.
as a horse.
Yeah. So what is this mysterious Injil? I've got a couple of shows on my channel discussing the Injil, which Muhammad had, which the Muslims actually had in their hands. However, for some odd reason, they failed to maintain one, a copy of it, and cannot show us this mysterious Injil. And two, it contains all sorts of Gnostic myths and other heretical stories, as well as children's tales from that time. And three, they don't even have a copy of the original Quran. So Muslims are very, very bad at keeping copies of books. Wouldn't you agree, Eric?
Well, I believe that they're terrible. if you number one of the Quran itself, when you burn everything that you have while trying to compile the correct one, yeah, you could say that they've had a really tough time of preserving their scriptures, to include the Hadith literature and to include the Sirah, and the list goes on.
Okay, so guys, today we're going to do one of those modern streams. We'll be here for the next 4 to 5 hours. So I hope you've got a packed lunch.
Okay.
Tell your boss you're busy for the next while. So yeah, Eric is going to take us through 397 slides, you said, plus Q&A.
I cut it down to 894 last night. I was able to take 3 off. Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. So let's get started because I have work tomorrow.
Okay, this presentation is geared towards refuting these claims that we get from Muslims about corruption. So I'm going to deal with essentially 4 areas here. The first one I'm going to talk about is how early the Gospels were written, and I am probably going to ruffle some feathers as far as if you're a traditionalist and you've learned anything in the seminary in the lab. Well, I would say 30 years ago and prior. Recent scholarship is catching up, but we'll get to that. The second thing is I'm going to talk about the preservation of the autographs, because this is a claim that is often made, is that we don't even know what the original says. We don't even know what the first copies of the copies of the copies of the copies of the copy, and this Bart Ehrman type mantra. So we're going to talk about that. We'll talk about the testimonial authenticity from the patristic writings that we get from the early church fathers. And then, of course, the corruption charge. I'm going to be using 5 sources. I got them right here. You're all interested. The first one is Cold Case Christianity. This is written by J. Warner Wallace. The second one is Gary Habermas's The Historical Jesus. The third one is Craig Evans and Jesus and the Manuscripts. This one, folks, if you do not have this book, you need to get it. It is.
Evans is a fantastic scholar.
Oh yeah, absolutely magnificent. And then, of course, Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and he does a great job of covering the early church fathers. And then, of course, Dan Wallace. And this one is Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament. All 5 of these gentlemen are very reputable scholars, with exception, I want to say J. Warner Wallace. He used to be a police officer, but he does a really good job of presenting. As a matter of fact, a lot of the material that I get as far as following the timeline for the majority of my early slides here come from his work. And I see Andrew's posted the books down there in chat. Thank you for doing that, Andrew. Oops, clicking on the wrong one. Okay, so let's look at the early dating of the Gospels. Normally, when we look at the traditional dating of them, they normally occur anywhere from 50 to 70 years after the crucifixion. But after looking at this and analyzing the internal evidences that we find within the Gospels and the epistles within the New Testament, That cannot be true. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to point out several different facts that we know from the Gospels and the epistles that clearly demonstrate that all of these are written prior to 70 AD. And why do I mention 70 AD? Well, 70 AD is where we have the destruction. I need to fix that. The destruction. That's destruction. I didn't make it wide enough. Text box wide enough. Of the Jewish temple in 70 AD by the Romans. And then I'm gonna put the Gospel of John prior to that, and I'm gonna show you specifically why. Prior to John, you're gonna have the writing of the book of Acts. Prior to Acts, you're gonna have Luke, and then prior to Luke, you're gonna have Matthew, and prior to Matthew, of course, you're gonna have Mark. And then in between there, we're gonna talk about the patristic fathers and traditions and the writings that support an early dating here, or support, I would say, lend credibility to the authorship and the messages that we find within the Gospels and the New Testament itself. And there's a couple other points that I want to make that show us that you have a bishop in I think it was 305 AD. He made this Bishop of Alexandria, Peter's his name, where he talks about the original autograph of John still in existence in 290 AD, and I'm going to get to that here during the presentation. Can
I mention something on this point? Something that I discovered recently, because I was researching the same topic to do talks on it myself, which is why I was happy that you were going to bring this up, because I'll probably tackle this myself in the near future. And the patristic fathers alone, just their writings. So there's something like 31,000 verses in the Bible, just over 31,000, and there's like 23,000 in the Old Testament and like 7,500 in the New Testament. So that's 31,000 verses. However, these verses are referenced by the fathers between 1 and 2 million times,
right,
in their own writings, which is incredible, which means you've got multiple attestations. These verses are repeated verbatim in multiple languages over centuries, and close to the source as well, early by the fathers. So we could reconstruct the Bible entirely just from the writings of these fathers.
Yeah, and
multiple times over, something like 200 times over, we could reconstruct the Bible just from their writings.
Go ahead, Connie.
Yeah, I totally agreed. Eric taught us that.
Oh,
a couple years ago. Yeah.
I tell you, I'm going to tell you.
He's our professor. We're his students.
I just make sure that we understand that I've had about 4 original thoughts in my entire lifetime. A lot of this material I either get from reading or studying, these topics. So I appreciate the shout out there, Connie, but a lot of it has to deal with you stand on the shoulders of the great people, and this,
of course,
you stand on the shoulders of the early church fathers.
That's all we can do.
Eric, do you want to tackle that question before I give an answer?
Which one is that? Well, I'm struggling to answer the following question. How does a complete Bible come from fragments? Well, just watch the show, or watch my presentation, and you're going to see how when we start talking about, because I know what you're saying. If I might be incorrect on this, but if you're saying that the fragments that we have, for the fragmentary evidences that we have from the first century manuscripts, cannot possibly make up the Bible, or the second century, second, third, and fourth centuries cannot possibly make up the Bible that we have today. That's not even necessarily true. But you also have different attestation on what was in them from the patristic fathers and also other writers. We're going to get to that. I'm going to handle that.
I mean, if I can add to that, so when you've got fragments, when you've got a fragment with a few verses, the fact is we have thousands of fragments. So it's not like when you look at the Quran, when you go find an early Quran, first or second century Quran, you're not going to find a complete Quran. None exists. Right. However, with the Bible, you have thousands of fragments, and these fragments cover all of the verses of the Bible. And these verses are written about by the church fathers, and they're written about in other sources. So it's like, for instance, if you need 100 fragments to make the Bible, we have 150 fragments. So we have far more fragments than are needed to reconstruct the Bible. And we've got multiple versions of various of these. So there's an abundance of these, in fact.
And the Bible
Thanks,
that
Eric.
today matches those fragments that are in existence. And we're going to talk, and I'm going to speak real briefly of. Let me just tell you why we only have fragmentary evidences of the Bible from the first, second, and third centuries. Is because they were written on papyri. Papyri is a very brittle form of paper, and despite the best conditions that you possibly have, the preservation in places like Egypt and places like the Middle East, throughout that region, despite that fact, you're still not going to preserve entire codexes or entire parts of a book despite that. And by claiming, or by trying to say that, okay, well, you don't have, a complete first century Bible, you don't have a complete second century Bible, etc. Well, then, we have copies of it, but then again, you're going to therefore have to disqualify all other works from antiquity, because we don't have originals or recent copies from those. As a matter of fact, the most recent copies that we have from many of those works are 400 and 500 years later, whereas the Bible, we at least have fragments within the first 100 years. The Ryland Papyrus P52 is very recent. Okay, and then also there is another comment made by Tertullian in 190 AD that talks about the originals, the extant originals of Paul's epistles still existing. So all these things come into are going to come into play when we start talking about how we can trust the New Testament and what is in it. And another example that I'm going to use is Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, because those were used for hundreds of years after they were published. And I'm going to use that criteria of the preservation of Scripture for not 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but for hundreds of years, centuries later. And that's what the focus of this is going to be. Okay, and that's Islam's the age of ignorance, is where I kind of put that at the end of my timeline there. I might have to modify that because that's kind of a provocative or polemical statement. Okay, let's look at the Gospels of themselves. The entire New Testament itself fails to describe the destruction of the Jewish temple. The most significant event in Jewish history in the first century or since is not mentioned one time in the entire New Testament. Nobody mentions this. If Christianity is an offshoot being grafted into the vine of Judaism, somebody, somewhere in those New Testament epistles and Gospels would have mentioned, especially the book of Acts, would have mentioned the destruction of the Jewish temple, but it's not there. When we look at all of the calamities that have befallen the Jewish people prior to that, we find them all over the Old Testament. The Babylonian captivity, the carrying off of the northern kingdom by the Assyrian Empire, the enslavement of the Jewish people in Egypt. All that we find in the Old Testament. So these catastrophes and calamities that have befallen the Jewish people, none of that is found in the New Testament at all. It doesn't describe the siege. Now, a lot of people just talk about the destruction of the Jewish temple, but the Jerusalem was under siege for 3 years. For 3 years, and it does not talk this. Does not mention this again at all. And if you wanted to corroborate the New Testament message of enduring suffering for your faith in Christ and things of that nature, what better example could you possibly have than the destruction of the Jewish temple? So how do we know that the Gospels and the entirety of the New Testament, with maybe save Revelation, I'm not being dogmatic about Revelation, but every other book within the New Testament, the 26 other books of the New Testament, how do we know that they were written prior to the destruction of the Jewish temple, other than the fact that the destruction is not mentioned? Well, John, if you go to the Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 2, it says, "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades." What has 5 roofed colonnades? The pool of Bethesda. has these colonnades there. When is this? Now. The Greek word, Dan Wallace goes to, and he's probably one of the foremost New Testament the Greek New Testament scholar in the United States today. And he is very solid, or he's very, what's the word I'm looking for? He's very particular about affirming that word, that Greek word, I don't speak Greek, but that Greek word means at the time that this book is being written, there is this. So there in Jerusalem now by the sheep gate are 5 colonnades. Well, if Jerusalem...
Just give me 1 second to just share my screen here. This is the Greek. It starts with now. You can see here, Strong's G, 1161, now. So that verse definitely starts with the word now.
Okay, good.
So yeah. Anyway, but that's what that word says. It's now.
And that's one of the major criticisms of Dan Wallace's paper that he prepared for this, is saying, well, that word can mean different things in the New Testament, and I'm not 100% sure.
That is true. The Greek words can have different meanings. The same word, depending on context, just like Arabic, a single Arabic word can have 30 different meanings.
Right, and that's the argument people make, and you know how they try to muddy the waters and try to kill you with all these non sequiturs. That this is one as far as the arguments against Dan Wallace's position is. But we know that Jerusalem was destroyed. We know, not we think, not we believe. We know Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. So if John is saying now there is in Jerusalem, how can those colonnades exist in Jerusalem if Jerusalem itself had been destroyed by the Romans? When you look and see where the Pool of Bethesda is, and this is important to understand location, right here. When the siege was being made, there were several siege walls that were made around the temple itself, and one of them ran right along here. Now, these siege walls were destroyed by Titus when they were attacking, and everything in between the outer wall of the temple was destroyed also to help the siege. So when we look at the Pool of Bethesda, it sits right here, and then you have a fortress right here that was kind of a place for the guard. So this is where a lot of the fighting and the attacking came through. But this also was used. So we're going to know that was that entire area right here was completely decimated during the siege by the Romans. So when John writes in 5:2, now there is in Jerusalem these colonnades, those colonnades no longer existed in 70 AD. This is how we can say, okay, John was written prior to 70 AD. Because John was not written in 90 AD, like some people have put forth. And there was even a lot of scholarship that was done that's saying that the Gospel of John was not written until like 150 or 160 AD. But when the discovery of P51 and the Ryland, P51 is P51 or P52?
I have a question.
The Ryland.
How was Solomon's temple built under the Dome of the Rock after the Dome of the Rock was built?
That's just, okay, again, you think like a Kaffir, and you cannot, and that's radical moderate on our show. I mean, okay, Kaffir, you're making too much sense. Please stop. That can't be true. It's, again, this is when you start talking about the fuzzy history that we get from Dawagandis and such. That's, how do you explain that? Well, and do you know, there's a friend that I have, John Isaac. John Isaac is Egyptian himself, and he has talked about the Jewish temple, or Masjid, is it Masjid al-Haram is what they call it in Mecca, or no, Al-Aqsa. I'm sorry,
the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Alexa, I should have said that.
The furthest mosque is not even in Jerusalem. is the furthest mosque is, as a matter of fact, there's a website that I have bookmarked here somewhere that talks about the furthest mosque is actually in Saudi Arabia itself. But I'm getting off topic. But the bottom line here is that you can trust the fact that John was written prior to 70 AD. Why? Because John is describing what is in Jerusalem, and he's talking about that. This is the story of the lame man trying to get into the pool of Bethesda to be healed. And you have this tradition where if you get in there first, your calamity or your ailments can be healed. Okay, so you have the destruction of the Jewish temple, and then you have John being written prior to that. Now, Luke, when we look at Luke, we're not going to discuss the Gospel of Luke real quick. Or first, we're going to discuss his second book, the book of Acts. The book of Acts ends with Paul being imprisoned in Rome. Now, if it ends with Paul being imprisoned in Rome, and Paul was martyred in AD 64, the logical sequence then would be, okay, so the book of Acts was written prior to 64 AD. The same thing with Peter is not mentioned in the book of Acts as being martyred. Somebody as prominent as Peter, as prominent as Paul, and their martyrdom, that most definitely would have come up in the book of Acts. And when we think of what Luke wrote about, he writes extensively about Paul and Peter's ministry. So Paul was still alive, Peter was still alive at the end of the book of Acts. So therefore, that would tell us that the book of Acts was written prior to 64 AD. But also, if you look at the death of James, the brother of Jesus, the death of the brother of Jesus, he was martyred in 62 AD. The brother of Jesus, the head of the Jerusalem church, would have most definitely been mentioned by Luke if the book was written after 62 AD. So therefore, that pushes the date of Acts back to at least 62 AD.
I did a talk on the Didache, and the date of the Didache is constantly shifting earlier and earlier. It's now, it was typically placed around 90, then around 70, then 60. Now scholars are placing it between 48 and 52, which is incredibly early.
Incredible. Jeez.
Yeah. The Didache does not, if I remember correctly, I have it up here. It does not, yeah, here we are. It does not mention does it mention the crucifixion of Christ, or is there any historical value in it?
It's not it's more of a practical manual. It's like a catechetical manual and training manual.
Right.
So it's like an introduction for new converts on what to do, how to do it, and so on. And it seems to predate most of the Gospels, except for perhaps Matthew, because it seems to quote certain references from Matthew. Portions of the Gospel may have been written then, but not entirely. And also, the Gospels were possibly only available in fragments because they weren't written completely. Certain scrolls, some pages were available. So it took a while for everything. They couldn't just run to the printer shop.
No, it is. This is what a lot of people they take for granted today, that, that the writing material was abundant at the time. And it's simply not true. Writing material or scrolls or anything written was very expensive at the time because you had to get a scribe to write it, and that is a big expense. But yeah, I was trying to think about whether or not there was any historical value. And that's why I bought it, because I wanted to see if there's any historical value with in it, and I don't recall finding any, but I'm willing to be wrong on that. Okay, so when we look at Luke, he does describe the death of Stephen. He describes the death of the brother of James, the brother of John, but he does not mention the most prominent apostles. When we start thinking about who in important, Andrew's not mentioned. You don't have, of course, the death of John is not there. You don't have the death of Paul. You don't have the death of Peter. All of these people are left out, but you will have the brother of John included, Stephen included. Well, why aren't you mentioning those other folks? Now, when we look at the Gospel of Luke itself, we know it predates Acts. So what are we going to put Acts at? Well, we're going to put Acts at least at 62 AD, because the brother of Jesus, James, died in 62 AD, and that's not even mentioned. So we would think that something of that significant would have been mentioned by Luke, who was writing an orderly account, he said, of what happened during the early church. But it's not there. So when you get to the introduction, we can see that his gospel was written prior to the book of Acts. Now, when we look at Paul, you got to follow the bouncing ball here. I guess I should have qualified that. Paul quotes Luke's gospel in his letter to Timothy. So Luke's gospel is being considered scripture. Now, when did Paul write his letter to Timothy? About 63 to 64 AD. And when he he pens this letter in 57 AD. I'm sorry. And this is what he says. He says, he quotes two passages here. You will not muzzle the ox, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. Well, when we look at these two verses, the Old Testament verse, you will not muzzle the ox, you find in Deuteronomy. And then the laborer is worthy of his wages, we find in Luke 10:7. So he's treating Luke's gospel, or passage from Luke's gospel, as it is authentic scripture. And let's go to this part right here. This part is even better. When we look at Paul being familiar with the Gospel of Luke, let's look at what he says about the Lord's Supper. Right here, where it says, "Do this in remembrance of me." Now, all four Gospels, if I'm not mistaken, have the Lord's Supper in them. However, only one of the Gospels has Jesus saying, as you take the wine, you take the bread, "Do this in remembrance of me." Now, that is in it's in 1 Corinthians. Now, 1 Corinthians, there's the important part. 1 Corinthians is written when? 55 to 56 AD. So if 1 Corinthians is written 55 to 56 AD, and it says, "Do this in remembrance of me," and Luke's gospel, the only gospel that says, is given and broken in remembrance, "Do this in remembrance of me," that will tell you that Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, is borrowing from something that he already knows is considered scripture, which is Luke's gospel, and that is 55 or 56 AD. So that pushes Luke's gospel back clear into the middle of the 50s.
Eric?
Yep.
And when it says, "Do this in remembrance of me," that's talking about the Jesus Christ, sacrificing his life on the cross.
Yeah. Well,
Amen.
it's talking about the institution of the Eucharist,
Right.
of the Lord's Supper. And
perhaps I can add to this also, because I did a talk on the Gnostic Gospels, and every single passage of the New Testament is quoted 100 to 150 years before the earliest books of the Gnostic Gospels. Because people like Dan Brown and really like to say that that the Gnostic Gospels came prior to the Gospels we have in the Bible, but all of these verses are quoted across multiple sources, like the Church Fathers and others, even non-friendly sources. The entire basically New Testament is quoted in outside sources before the Gnostic Gospels even got written.
Well, what's interesting that a lot of people may not be aware, in the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas is Gnostic in and of itself for a number of reasons. Number one, it begins off, "These are the secret teachings of Jesus." Well, what was Gnosticism about? It was all about secret
teachings. Yeah.
It quotes 13 or 15, I can't remember the number, 13 or 15 separate New Testament books. Meaning that if it's written in the first century, there's no way somebody's going to have access or understand the reliability of the scripture, or whether it be accepted scripture that early. So it again, and then thirdly, it quotes from the Diatessaron by Tatian. Tatian wrote the Diatessaron, I think like 170, 175, somewhere around that neighborhood. And so the Gospel of Thomas is quoting directly from the Diatessaron, which is, everybody should know that it's a synthesization of all four Gospels together. And then lastly, it's very aesthetic in nature. It has Jesus saying that you should never get married, you should never have sex, you should. I think he's even a vegan of some sort in that book. So when we look at the Gnostic writers themselves, just like as you were saying, and how they had access to all of these epistles and gospels, and to try to say that the Gnostic writers were some sort of authoritative writers is absolutely ridiculous. And again, Craig Evans does a really good job in his book. Craig Evans does a really good job in his book addressing that specific. What did he say about that? Go ahead. I want to see if I can find
if I can mention, so there's the Gospel of Thomas, but there's a second gospel, which is a completely different writing, Gnostic writing, called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Mm-hmm. And it has also been used to claim that it is one of the original writings of the gospel, that the Catholic Church beat everyone up with sticks and then threw out these amazingly great stories. This contains the writings that are in the Quran, for instance, where Jesus makes these clay birds and Jesus kills a boy and whatnot.
Right.
So the whole clay bird story is here. And the very earliest copy of this particular gospel of Infancy Gospel of Thomas has been identified, and it is the scholars date the papyrus to the 4th or early 5th century. This is hundreds of years after the Gospels. Mm-hmm. So the very earliest copy of this is now being discovered, and it is extremely late compared to the Gospels. And this is where the Quran is drawing its apocryphal stories from, for instance.
And those stories, and this is what people need to understand, those stories about Jesus speaking from the cradles, Jesus making clay birds and things of that nature, are ripoffs. They're plagiarisms. And Muhammad was passing these plagiarisms off as some sort of divine revelation from God. This guy here, William St. Clair Tisdale, this is a fabulous book when you want to start analyzing what or where Muhammad got his messages, his Gabriel from. Well, he got it from a lot of these old stories that were already pre-existent, circulating in Arabia at that time.
Yeah. Just by the way, this was available in Latin, Syriac, Ethiopic, Armenian, Georgian, Arabic, Gaelic, and Slavonic. Incredible, including Greek.
In the 4th, 5th century, are you saying?
Apparently so.
Wow.
It was very widely spread in multiple languages. So incredible. So yeah, just thought I'd raise that.
Yeah. You know, with all these so-called manuscripts out there, it's a wonder that Muhammad never chose to take it from from the New Testament.
They never had an original. From what I can determine, he never actually had a full written copy of the Bible. We know that the Ethiopians had one, and they would recite it orally. And it seems that his knowledge was oral, not actually from a written copy. And also, I've got scholarship I have not had a chance to do on my channel. But the area where he grew up, supposedly anyway, was a hotbed of heresies. In fact, it was called Arabia Heresium Ferax, or Arabia, the bearer of heresies. It was one of the primary locations of heresy in the world at that time. And there were, for instance, multiple contested versions of the Gospel of Matthew. Like 6 different Gnostic versions existed at the time, and people were confused as to which is the original and which are the fakes.
Well, I was even. Well, I'm not going to go there. Never mind. I'm not going to touch that, because we could spend another hour talking about what he plagiarized and what he.
We can do that in a different day.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Sounds great.
Okay. So Luke, Gospel Luke, 56 AD. we can push the Gospel of Luke back to 56 AD. So you have the destruction of the Jewish temple, 70. You have the writing of the Gospel of John prior to that, whether that's 67, 68, 69, or whatever. And then you have, of course, the book of Acts, which ends with Paul in prison. And since Paul was in prison and Paul was martyred in 64, 65 AD, we know that the book of Acts was written at least prior to that. But when you also include the fact that the brother of Jesus, James, the head of the Jerusalem church, was martyred in 62 AD, you can push the book of Acts back prior to 62 AD. And then when you get to the Gospel of Luke, because you have Paul quoting in Corinthians, do this in remembrance of me, we can push the Gospel of Luke back prior to 56 AD when Paul wrote the letter to the First Corinthians. And the First Corinthians there's no dispute about Pauline authorship in that, just to make sure that, some of the people out there want to argue that. And then, okay, let's look at Luke getting a lot of his material from Mark, pushing the Gospels of Mark and Matthew back earlier to 56, 55 AD. Luke admitted he was not an eyewitness to the life of Jesus. So where did he get the information from? And I'm going to go to the patristic writings and the early church fathers to verify a lot of this. But when we look at Luke, he repeats entire passages that are in Mark and Matthew. 350 verses from Mark appear in his gospel. 250 verses from Matthew appear in these in his gospels. So Matthew and Mark had been widely circulating prior to the Gospel of Luke being writing. So it's reasonable to make the conclusion that Matthew and Mark were written anywhere from 50 to 52 AD. Some people put it Mark as early as 45 AD. I don't know exactly how they do that, but some people do. But I would put it 50, 52 AD. So when we look at the early attestation to the gospel message, to what Christ did in the gospels, we can put those gospels within 20 years, beginning within 20 years to a maximum of 37 years with the Gospel of John from the cross. That is very early. People need to understand that when we're talking about ancient writings, that is very, very early when it talks about opining upon when people start writing about historical events. Most historical events are not even bothered to be written down within 100 or 200 years of the event itself. For example, take the Sirah of Muhammad, his biography. When was his biography written? Well, his first biography
250 years after his death at best.
Yeah, even Ishaq was again 130, let's see, 632, 760 is when Ishaq was supposedly alive. So that's 120, 130 years after. But we don't even have anything from Ishaq. We have to go to Hisham, which wrote an entire century after that. So when we start talking about early attestation about the life of Christ, it far surpasses anything that Muslims might think that they have about Muhammad. So, number one, Gospels were written early, therefore you don't have room for embellishment. The Gospel accounts of death, deity, and resurrection, all three which are denied in the Quran by Muhammad. And you have, of course, a huge multiplicity of manuscripts that we have in there. So you have all of these different Gospels written prior to 70 AD. Now, early church fathers, patristic authorship. A lot of people, when we look at Islam, they talk about the hadith and the narrations that they have as far as, what Muhammad did, what Muhammad said, and that's oral tradition. The hadith literature did not begin to be written down and codified or put together until Bukhari put it together. I think that was 870 AD. Now, if you do the math, that's 2.5 centuries after the death of Muhammad, that you have at least, 20 separate generations or 20 separate iterations of people saying so-and-so said, so-and-so said, so-and-so said, so-and-so said. And you're going to believe that? Really? We as Christians have a written transmission of authorship that we can put our fingers on and say, look, we don't have this so and so said, so and so said, so and so said. We have an actual chain of authorship, and I'm going to go through that here in just a minute.
I just want to highlight something since you said 870. This is the same period as Bukhari. This is the Mount Sinai Arabic New Testament Codex 151. Comes from Egypt, Sinai. And the earliest New Testament Arabic translation that we know of is the Mount Sinai Arabic Codex, this one. And this is 253 AH, Hijrah. And Jesus is called Yeshua. He is not called Isa. So how is it that he's called Isa within the Muslim writings, but the earliest full Arabic New Testament calls him Yeshua? So just a point of of interest.
151. I'm writing that down. That's important for something that I'm working on.
Okay, so this is according to the Hadith. Is that correct? That it says Yeshua?
No. This is a New Testament translation in Arabic.
My bad. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Earliest known New Testament Arabic translation from the Sinai in Egypt. Let me go up here. You'll see this one is this is from this monastery here. So these people were living outside of this. Yeah, well, you can see that's St. Catherine's Monastery. This is where this comes from.
So if that's written in Arabic, Yeshua, how come the Quran says Isa? Has anybody ever figured that out?
I'll bring up something on that. Let Eric go back to his thing, and I'll bring up the Isa thing in a bit.
Okay, yeah, and this is the thing about Islam. It doesn't have the right Jesus. It doesn't have the right mother of Mary, the mother of Jesus. I mean, it doesn't even have Jesus being crucified. This is why it's easy. I'll say it's easy. It's hard to convince Muslims that the Quran is wrong. However, it's easy to demonstrate that the Quran itself is wrong because it can't even get the name of Jesus correct and get his genealogy correct.
So this is a very fairly recent finding. I subscribe to the Biblical Archaeology newsletter, which is about their publication is about $30 a year, $33 a year. The earliest evidence of Christianity in Arabia, and this is the Jordanian desert, and it uses the name Isa, right? So this actually uses, so this is here, this is east of Amman, that's Jerusalem here, and it actually uses the name Isa, and this is where they found it, this pile of rocks here, this inscription. And so basically this looks like Arabs that were, it's Safayitic language, and they were using Isa here. So it says here, so it adds a commendation of his deceased uncle and finally concludes with a unique religious invocation to Isa, which corresponds to the name given to Jesus in the Quran. O Isa, help him against those who deny you. So, and that's the inscription here, Isa. So Safayitic in this region. So I can send you guys this document. I'll send it to you.
Please, yeah. What? Okay, but what? Who created this? This was, where did you say this was? This was in Syria?
This is the region where it was found. It was written on this somewhere in this jumble of rocks you see here in this rock desert, and it comes from this area here, this Wadi Hara or whatever, in Jordan to the east here, Wadi al Qudari.
So you're thinking what you're thinking is this is where Muhammad drew on that name, or had?
No, I don't know. I mean, no, it's been a while since I've read it, so I can't remember what it says. But I just wanted to mention there is a reference, at least within one culture, where that seems to be the word. But I'll send you guys the document, and there's more you can research on that.
Okay, so early church fathers, and I'm not going to go too far in depth or spend a lot of time with the early church fathers, other than the fact to show or some type of succession here with the gospel message. We see that the gospels were written early, so how do we know that is what the apostles taught? Well, we have the testimonies of John, and of course, John had several disciples, Ignatius, Polycarp, and a gentleman by the name of Papias. But you also have the connectivity between Peter, knowing Ignatius, who knew John, and Clement of Rome. And then Clement of Rome also knew Paul. And we have writings from all four of these. Well, we don't have anything from Papias. What we have from Papias is everything that we have from Papias was written by Eusebius, and he had access to the teachings of Papias, or had the writings of Eusebius when he wrote. So then you have from John, you have his main disciple was a gentleman by the name of Polycarp. I'm sure many people have heard of Polycarp. And Polycarp had a pupil by the name of Irenaeus. And Irenaeus had several people learn from him. And you have a chain here of the people who learned from Irenaeus. So you have a direct line in writing of people going all the way back to Jesus Christ. Now let's go ahead and start with Papias, or Clement of Rome. I'm sorry, Clement of Rome is listed by Irenaeus and Tertullian as being the bishop of Rome until his death in 99 AD. He became the leader of Rome after the death of Peter and Paul, and he basically taught what Peter and Paul taught. So his works are all considered authoritative. Papias was a student of the disciple John, and he wrote a book called The Sayings of the Lord, or a series of books. So he knows John. He compiled the sayings of Christ from what he got from John. And a lot of people think that the story that we find that's often, and this is often a charge. Look, we have this story here that's not in the earliest writings, the woman caught in adultery. This is John chapter 7 into chapter 8. And we're trying to figure out where this story came from. Well, it's in Papias's writings is where it actually comes from. And it's such a beautiful story, somebody decided to insert it into the Gospel of John itself. And a lot of the history of the church, of who was related to who and how they were related, we get from Papias's writings. And then you have Polycarp. Polycarp was a direct student of John, the apostle. And he, this, and a lot of these sayings that I'm going to cite here deal with the deity of Christ, because this idea, this charge that there was corruption added into the Gospels by the early scribes and by the early church writers, that it's a farce. It's a lie is what it is, because when you look at what the early church fathers said about Jesus Christ being God incarnate, you cannot make that argument that you had this corruption seep into the gospel message. And notice how Polycarp refers to Jesus. He believes in our Lord and God, who? Jesus Christ. From Polycarp. The next one we have is Ignatius. He's the bishop in Antioch. He was also a disciple of John, and he writes all kinds of letters himself. And look what he calls Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, our God. This idea that Jesus was made God by the Council of Nicaea or anything like that is absolutely ridiculous in light of what the early church fathers taught about Jesus. When you look at, again, more from Ignatius, for our God, Jesus the Christ. Consequently, it says that all magic and every kind of spell was dissolved. God appeared in human form. Gee, I wonder who that was. For our God, Jesus Christ. So this is Ignatius saying that Jesus Christ was God. This, again, Jesus, John, Ignatius. This is a direct testimony in writing from the early church fathers. And then, of course, go ahead.
I just did what's on the screen now.
Three mosaics, including to the God Jesus, yeah.
So that's very early.
Really? Yeah, that's second. It's 200s mosaics, inscriptions including. Wow.
So this is it here.
Wow.
That
I'd
was
like
from Andy. Thank you, Andy, for that heads up. Much appreciated.
Beautiful.
So
Yeah.
back to you. I'll drop the link in the chat now. I've also dropped the link to the ESA document for everyone in the chat, and I've sent you both on Skype that document that I showed earlier.
Thank you, Lord.
Well, how's it said? With every turn of the archaeologist's spade, the Bible is proven again and again and again and again and again. This is just
Yes.
another example of that. Okay, Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus, let's follow the chain here. Okay, you have Jesus, of course. Then you have John, Polycarp, and then a student of Polycarp, who was a direct student of John, is Irenaeus. Irenaeus says that Jesus Christ is our Lord and our God. Christ himself is the God of the living. He himself, in his own right, lived God and Lord, King eternal. Justin Martyr, again, a Christian apologist, says Christ being Lord and what? And a prophet? No, and God.
And God.
God. Christ is called both God and Lord. He was God and the Son of the unbegotten. Clement of Alexandria. Now, if you look where Clement of Alexandria is, you have Justin Martyr, who's a student of Irenaeus, Tatian, and then Clement of Alexandria. What does he say? He alone, being both God and man, he appeared as the teacher as God. He is made equal to the Lord of the universe. So you have here, what we have is this direct attestation that Jesus Christ was viewed as God incarnate. This was not something that morphed over time. And when we look at the early writings of the Gospels, the early writing says that Jesus Christ was God incarnate, and the early church fathers following that tradition did not change it. They affirmed what was taught early, right after the life of Christ. Now, there's something else here that I wanted to get to. These are all the early church fathers. Let me go past this. I'm taking up too much time. But when we look at the authorship and the confirmation of the authorship of each of the Gospels, because this is another claim that is made. Well, we don't even know who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Don't know who wrote the Gospel of Mark. Don't know who wrote it. Don't. It's a gospel according to a gospel according to. Again, this is an attempt by most Muslims to try to confuse you and to try to break your faith in what we have in the Bible. Number one, with Matthew, there's internal evidence that shows that Matthew, who was the tax collector, wrote Matthew, and the reason why is the references to money. Only somebody that works in banking or in finance, something along those lines, would use that type of language when describing money. Papias says that Matthew compiled the sayings of Christ in the Hebrew language, and the audience for Matthew, of course, was the Hebrews, were the Jews. It wasn't the Gentiles. And there's no mention of any disputes in church history of Matthean authorship. And Irenaeus says that, who was a student of Polycarp, who was a student of John, says that Matthew was the author of the Gospel of Matthew. Mark shares just as much similar attestation as Matthew. Irenaeus mentions Mark was the author of the Gospel of Mark. Tertullian, that which Mark published, may be affirmed by Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was. So he's saying that Mark wrote what Peter told him to write. Irenaeus says the same. That's consistent with what church history teaches. Clement of Alexandria affirms that. Mark, again, is affirmed by Origen. Justin Martyr affirms him. And when you look at the anti-Marcionite prologue, it says Mark declared, who is, it calls him Stump Finger because he had short fingers. He says that he was Peter's interpreter. Luke, same thing. You have just as much attestation. You have Irenaeus. As a matter of fact, you have Luke himself saying that I wrote this. And then you have Justin Martyr affirming it, and the Martyrian canon has that in there. And then John, of course, Irenaeus says that John wrote John. and Don Guthrie affirms that it says that there's no doubt that Irenaeus accepted John as the apostle. Now think of who Irenaeus is. You have John, Polycarp, Irenaeus. Polycarp is going to tell Irenaeus who wrote the Gospel of John. Tatian mentions him when he writes the Diatessaron. Tertullian mentions him as the author of that, and Clement of Alexandria. They all say that John wrote John. So here's even more. Origen, Diablos of Antioch, and the prologue. Okay. But even, and this is even a better one. You go to the Sirah of Muhammad, the Sirah Rasulallah, and you go to page 103 and 104. You never guess who else affirms that John wrote the Gospel of John. Well, evidently, in Islamic writings themselves, they say John the Apostle sat down for them when he wrote what? The Gospel for them. Now, is that the Injil that they're talking about? I don't know if it is. They're pretty inconsistent with that. So the conclusion with the early church fathers, you have early attestation to the author or who wrote the Gospels by the early church fathers. So you have the destruction of the temple, John being written in 70 AD, Acts being written before 62 AD, Luke being written before 56 AD, the Gospel of Matthew and Mark back to 50 and 52 AD. This is affirmed by the early church fathers, as we saw in those writings. And when we look at other writings, as far as they're concerned, we have the Gospels written from about 45 to 70. We have a first fragment, the Ryland Papyrus, is dated to 130 AD, but we have 5,600 copies of the New Testament. The New Testament, average New Testament manuscript has over 450 pages in it, oh, by the way. When you compare that to other writings, you have Homer, which was written 900 BC. It's kind of an oral tradition to begin with, but then it was written down. And the earliest copy you have is 500 years later. Aristotle.
If I can mention something on that, the average ancient document that we consider to be highly attested has on average, I think, 5 copies. So typically 12 if you're lucky, but something like that is 5 to 12 copies for what we consider highly attested. And the Bible has literally like nearly 6,000.
Right. Yeah. And that's just the Greek copies. We have all kinds of Latin when they moved away from Greek to the Latin in the 3rd century. So in all, we can say we have about 25,000 New Testament manuscripts.
Can I just mention something relevant to this? Sorry, finish your point, and I'd like to just raise something relevant.
No, go ahead. I'm just saying, if you have the earliest, what you're saying is that the earliest copies that we have of works from antiquity, we only have a few of them. Number one, the average, I think I don't know what the average number is, but when you compare that to what we have with the New Testament, number one, we have what Dan Wallace calls an embarrassment of riches, because we have thousands of manuscripts compared to 10, 15, 20 maybe. And then the earliest manuscripts that we have as a relationship to the event in which they describe is like exponentially better than what we have. Like I just mentioned Homer, we have, copies, but the earliest copy is 500 years prior to that.
And maybe Muslims can give us a copy of the Injil or the original Bible that Muhammad was saying that the Jews had between their hands, or maybe their early Quran, so we can actually see it. But I'll hope you guys can send me photos of it or something. Send me a copy. By the way, so this is Bukhari hadith. So part of the reason that this is relevant is that there is a huge library, which if you had to stack up literally the Bible copies that we have, they would be the height of 3 or 4 Empire State Buildings.
Right.
That'd be a mile high.
Sure.
Whereas if you took the old Quran copies that we have, they'd be like 2 foot nothing, 3 foot. You'd have basically nothing by comparison. But Muslims were making the claim very early on that the Gospels had been corrupted. They call this the claim of tahrif, tahrif. That's this here. However, when you go through the Muslim sources, as I did in my series called Polemics, Paul, as in Paul, as to why Muslims attack Paul constantly. If you read through the scholars of Islam, they constantly make the claim that the Bible was corrupted by Christians misrepresenting the meaning of the words. Not that the Bible had been rewritten or edited, had the wording changed, but that we misrepresented, we misunderstood, we misread, we didn't interpret it correctly. So even here, Bukhari, right, writes that so the Jews and Christians could corrupt by misrepresenting the meaning of the words. So this is what was the general view at the time, that we misrepresented the words. And then the story changed later on. For instance, Ibn Hazm, the Spanish genius who's here on a Spanish postage stamp. So in the 11th century, Ibn Hazm brings the accusation of textual corruption, tahrif, of the Bible. So Gerhard Niels writes the article, Why Do Muslims Believe the Text of the Bible Has Been Corrupted? And he writes in his article, in 1064, Ibn Hazm, from the ruling hierarchy of the Umayyad government in Cordoba, Spain, charged that the Bible had been corrupted and falsified. Now suddenly, 300 years later, we no longer have we misinterpreting it. No, you've written a fresh copy of it. The charge was to defend Islam against Christianity because Ibn Hazm came upon differences and contradiction between the Bible and the Quran. Now, this is in the 11th century, the 1000s, the middle of the 1000s. So this means that for the very first time, Muslims seems to be in Spain in the 1000s finally actually picked up a Bible to read it. Prior to that, it seems that they only had Gnostic Gospels and other sort of apocryphal sources, right? So that's why the Quran has all these Gnostic and apocryphal sources. So believing by faith that the Quran was true, the Bible then has to be false. So we said since the Quran must be true, it must be the conflicting gospel texts that are false. But present texts must have been falsified by Christians, note, after the time of Muhammad. However, now this man is supposed to be an incredible genius, the greatest Islamic genius of his era, the greatest Islamic genius in Spain, one of the top scholars to ever live in Islam. The problem is that the same early Christian documents that we're referencing now from the 1st and 2nd centuries are the exact same ones as the 7th century, are the exact same ones as the 10th and 12th and 15th and 16th centuries. Am I correct,
Right.
Eric?
Yeah, we can go clear back to the 3rd century with Codex Vaticanus.
Yeah.
And so yeah, go ahead.
So these claims by Muslim scholars are all over the place, but just following these claims, Bukhari has one claim, then you have other scholars with other claims, and this guy says, no, it's after the time of Muhammad. So we apparently had the original Bible at the time of Muhammad. So there's questions here, that's all.
Right, because the same Bible that we have today predates Muhammad by centuries. Actually, the Quran, never mind. I was going to say the Quran predates Muhammad by a couple centuries too, if you look at the Sana manuscript. Anyway, quit making sense. Okay, so a couple of those other writings that you had alluded to. You look at some of the copies that they have when they were written, and when the first extant copies appear. I mean, look at Aristotle. His first extant copies don't appear until 1100 A.D. I mean, that's 1400 years for crying out loud. I believe that they're from Aristotle. The reason why we don't have the originals of Aristotle is because somebody burned the Alexandrian library in 638. I won't mention any names. Omar, won't say that. And then you have Tacitus, his histories, again, 1,000 years or 1,000 years from his writings. Suetonius, and then Herodotus. I mean, you just see how long the length is from where they lived to the earliest extant copy, and then the number of copies that we have. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is, because you just alluded to it, that the Christians changed the writings of the Gospels. And when they received a letter from one of the apostles, that they would copy that, and the copying would be haphazard, and there would be all kinds of errors in it. And it gets to the point where, if you got a copy of 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 a copy, you're never going to know what the original said. And this is not true. And the reason why is because the early churches held on to the letters from the apostles. If you received a letter from, let's say, Donald Trump. Now, you might not like Trump, and that's fine. Okay, but
I'm thinking of making a visit, because I'm thinking of applying for my visa, but the U.S. visa department told me, why not just come in through Mexico? It's cheaper and quicker.
It would be a lot easier also, and you would get paid.
And they'll probably give me a house and a check and checks every month and a phone.
You get a cell phone.
Oh yeah, and you got the dark skin, so it's like, come on in.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. So
Come on in.
If you received a letter from Donald Trump, would you hang on to that letter, or would you just?
It's the president, sure.
He's the president.
Of course.
Would you give that letter to one of your children? Of course.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an heirloom. Yeah.
Would your child give that to their child? Would they keep that letter? And would they preserve that letter? And the answer is yes, because they realize who the author is, and they realize the importance of what is in the letter itself. The early churches did the same thing. And when you look at Oxyrhynchus, there you go, Oxyrhynchus. You had two guys from England, British guys. Of course, Britons go around stealing everything. They went to Egypt, Oxyrhynchus, in 1896 looking for ancient manuscripts. And they found a dump, or were told to go out in the desert and look in this one spot here, and they found a dump of literally tens of thousands of manuscripts. And by using stratigraphy and paleography, they're seeing that these letters, or these literal libraries of documents that were in the Egyptian sand, were put there around the 4th or the 5th century. But when they examine the documents, they're seeing that the documents themselves were originated in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. So what this tells us is that documents were used for centuries. Let that sink in. Documents were kept and used for centuries in antiquity. Most of the documents that they have there were 75 or 100 to 125 years old, but all the way out to 300 years old. As a matter of fact, some of them were 500 years old. They dated using paleography. They dated clear back to the 1st century. So here you have a demonstration, a confirmation that in the ancient world, they would preserve these writings. They weren't something that you would take, like, for example, this book right here. As good as this book is, I doubt if I will this to my children are going to keep this book. They might give it to their children, but this book is not going to stick around for 100 years or 150 years, let alone 200 years. Here in the ancient world, they did stay around for a long time. And we can also see this is verified with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of the scrolls that were uncovered had been used for 100 to 150 years. 40 of them were dated that they had been used for 200 years. And they date this from using the end date of 70 AD or 73 AD, when the Romans had laid siege to Masada. That they know that these documents predate that by centuries. So the Essenes in Qumran, it's demonstrated that they were using these documents for centuries. When we look at Christian works, Codex Vaticanus, created in the 5th century or 4th century. This was used, it's documented that it was used, folks, it was used, the Vaticanus was used for 600 100 years. When you look at Santiaticus, same thing. Created in the 4th century, it was used clear out to the 7th century. So these documents that were used by ancient Christendom were used for centuries after them. Same thing with Codex Bezae, where we get, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the translation from the King James Version of the Bible came from Codex Bezae. But this is the most interesting fact from this book that I found, from Craig Wynn's book. This is on page.
I do.
Page. Come on, where is it? Manuscripts. Come on. You think I would have had this? Here it is, page 88. Page 88. There is a mention of the Gospel of John during. Now this is written in 305 by the Bishop of Alexander. Peter was his name, in 305. And he's referencing the Gospel of John. Now listen to what it says here. This is important. The Gospel of John, written 70 AD. Now was the preparation of the 3rd hour, as the accurate books have it, and the autograph itself of who? The evangelist John, which is, this is kind of like what John says, and now you will find in Jerusalem by the sheep gate colonnades, which is up to this day, has by the grace of God been preserved in the most holy church of Ephesus. What Peter is saying here is that the Gospel of John, the autograph. Now, what is an autograph? An autograph is the original. When letters were created, people would have 2 letters written by a scribe. And then the one that was sent out to the person that the letters to, they would sign with an autograph. That's why they're called the autographs. Peter here is saying that the autograph of John is still in existence in the church of Ephesus. This is over 200 years. Now, if you are someone who is looking to copy the Gospel of John, was it still available to copy?
Yes.
Okay, so this claim, this Bart Ehrman claim, a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, is a bunch of crap. The extant autograph, the autographs circulated and stayed in existence for centuries. And if they ever wanted to refer back to what the original writing was, again, Craig Evans cites several examples of where the patristic writings reference the autographs, going back to refute all of the heresies that came up. A dialogue with Trypho against heresies by Irenaeus. They say, okay, if you are going to say that this is true, then you are going to have to cite to me an earlier gospel than what we have now, which is in the autographs. This throws this idea of the creeping in of different viewpoints or desires to change Christianity into the trash completely. You have other references.
Maybe can I make a point on that? Because Bart Ehrman knows for a fact that he doesn't really believe that, right? Because when he's questioned by scholars on that point, he'll say the Gospels say exactly, effectively what happened, and he doesn't admit to corruption in the Gospels, right? But he knows he makes a lot of money. But just for everyone's own knowledge, Bart Ehrman belongs to what is called the Bauer School of Theology. Now, this was associated with a guy called, a German, of course, called Ferdinand Christian Bauer. And he was in the Tübingen School of Theology, which adopted shall we say, a Marxist dialectical view of religion, right? And which came from Hegel, who influenced Marx. So Bauer, he was influenced by Hegel's theory of dialectic. He argued that 2nd century Christianity was a synthesis of 2 opposing theses, right? Thesis, and so it's Marxism, basically, right?
Yes, it is.
And he believed that early Christianity was characterized by diversity and conflict, right? And that what later became considered as heresies actually represented the original and accepted forms of Christianity. So heresies were actually the original Christianity. So he says, and then Walter Bauer, another figure, slightly different name, right, challenges that. He writes a book called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. He says that in church regions, the earliest form of Christianity was later labeled as heresy. So he says that heresies are not corruptions, but the original expression. So, so this is where Bart Ehrman gets his ideas from. Two guys, one called Baur, Baur, and one called Bauer, Bauer. So Bart Ehrman belongs to a school that is utterly heretical. Basically, they say that heresies are authentic.
Wow.
Gnostic view, yeah.
Hey, Lloyd, I was just noticing in chat. Oh my goodness, I don't understand why it's not doing. Somebody was talking about watching this again. If you email me, I'll send you a copy of the slideshow. So if anybody in the audience wants to get a copy of this, email. I don't have a problem sending it to you. At Eric Thecaffer, ericthecaffer@gmail.com. As a matter of fact, just use my name on the screen. It's at gmail.com. Okay. What was I going to say about this? There are other references also to other manuscripts. If you look at Tertullian writing in 190 AD, when he's writing a prescription against heretics, he cites that Paul's autographs still exist. He mentions an autograph still in Corinth, Philippi, and Ephesus. And he also defends the Gospel of Luke by asserting that it is still in existence to be consulted. So you have Tertullian, early church father, saying that, hey, and what is he writing? 190 AD. So this is 150 years after the Gospels are written, and these Pauline epistles are still being are still in existence. You have Gaius of Rome saying that the divine scriptures, when people are making, or they're combating these heresies that are trying to creep their way into the Christian church, they're saying, look, we can lay our hands on the divine scriptures. They can't, nor can they show they have originals of what the gospel writers had. You have Augustine writing in 400 when he's disputing with the Manichaeans. And here, listen to what he says. He says, if there's any uncertainty remain, we should consult the original text. So if you're going to consult the original text, how are you going to do that? You're going to have to look at the what?
The autograph.
Yeah, the autographs. You're going to have to look at the original text. So in conclusion, you have ancient texts that they're used for centuries. This isn't something where they would get a letter, they would copy it, and then they would tear up the original and throw it away and burn it or whatever. No, this is something that they would preserve. As a matter of fact, they talk about venerating these original autographs, and a lot of, especially in the Gospel of John, venerating it. I wouldn't say worshiping it, but at least they're venerating them. You have again the direct attestations to the gospel, the existence of the original gospels of John and Luke centuries later. They would go back and consult the autographs, the originals, when making copies or when trying to determine whether something was in the gospel or not. And again, this is when you were fighting heresies in orthodoxy. This is what they would use. Okay, last thing here, and then I'll be done. I see we're going long, and I don't want you to get past.
Do you want to continue on another day to continue with this, or?
This is going to go fast. I only got a couple things left. When we look at variants, this is from Dan Wallace's book, Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament. And here's where he talks about how we have 5,800. I think it's 50. That's a typo. That's supposed to be 5,600 Greek New Testament. We have 10,000 Latin, 5,000 types of others where you talk about Coptic, Ethiopian, Syriac, Armenian, all those other languages that the New Testament was written into. And he says that we have an embarrassment of riches. We have more exponentially, not just more, but exponentially more New Testament manuscripts than any other work from the ancient world. You just don't get anything even close to that. And then to try to disparage that writing is just absolute idiocy. And if you are a Dawagandist or you're a Muslim polemicist attacking Christianity, you have to step outside. This is why these guys don't get peer reviewed. They don't have peer. They don't publish in peer reviewed journals. Why? Because all of these positions that they have are absolutely ridiculous, and they get shot down. In the New Testament, we have about 140,000 words, but here's the charge: we have 300 to 400,000 different variants. And this is true. That is true. And the reason why it's true is because we have so many manuscripts. That's why we have so many variants. If you only have one manuscript, how many variants are you going to have in that one manuscript?
Not many.
None. You can't. You can't. There's nothing to compare it to. So you can't have any variants. The reason why we have so many variants is because we do have so many manuscripts.
But variants are also because in different languages you can use different words to say the same thing.
Right.
And that's what they do.
I really like burgers. I really enjoy burgers. I love me a burger. Oh my gosh, burgers are awesome. I really dig burgers. It's exactly
Right.
It means the same thing, but they just phrase differently. That's what the variants often are.
Yeah, Dan Wallace does a great job. Let me see here, where he uses just a simple phrase in Greek, where it can be said hundreds of different ways. I can't remember what the phrase is.
He shows like 1,000 ways to write the same sentence, and it's like a 5-word sentence.
Right. Yeah.
Like a really short sentence. I know it. I know what you mean exactly. But yeah.
He wrote it in his book. I can't remember, but anyway. But yeah. So those variants are mainly spelling differences, word order changes, sometimes. Yeah, right, because they didn't have a Webster's dictionary back then, so you could spell a word different ways. Well, if you spell a word a different way, that's a variant. Is it the same word? Yeah, you just spelled it differently. And so when he talks about these variants, 99.9% of them, only 1/10 of 1% of these variants are meaningful or viable, meaning that they can change the meaning of the text or don't appear in other manuscripts. For example, the woman caught in adultery, the long ending to Mark, 1 John 5:7. Those you can sit there and you can point at and say, okay, these do have an impact on the text, but the point is that none of them impact any core Christian beliefs. So to say that the Gospels have been corrupted, we can't trust them, is an exercise in idiocy. You have to be an idiot, and I'm saying that with all sincerity and with no offense to idiots, but you have to be an idiot to think that the gospel message, the New Testament, has been changed to the point where the central messages and teachings of the Gospels, of the New Testament, cannot be understood. You really have to be that kind of special stupid. You have 20,000 lines of text in the New Testament. Only 40 of those 20,000 lines of text are in question, and that includes the insertions. Only 40 out of 20,000. And it has no impact on whether Jesus Christ was crucified, whether or not Jesus Christ was the Son of God, whether Jesus Christ was resurrection, whether or not people considered him the Son of God, whether or not there's none of that is in question when you look at the variants.
And then you've also got the context from the early authors, which will talk about these things, so you don't have to scratch around in the dark, because you've already got early practice from these authors that tell you how this was understood.
Right, the patristic writings, the early church fathers, and what they tell us, what they think these things meant. Quoting.
And also, I mean, any human endeavor is going to introduce errors. If you're writing 40,000 verses, for argument's sake, right? If you're writing 41,000 verses by hand, you are going to have variance, because no human endeavor is going to be perfect. We're not making photocopies. They're not sending emails. This was practice of fairly primitive means of communication.
Yeah, and even when you look at the Quran has variants in it. You look at the different Qurans that are out there. Today, Dan what's it, Brubaker, is that his name?
Yes, Dan Brubaker.
Yeah,
Does
yeah.
a really good job of outlining the differences, the variants that we have in the Quran itself. And there's, I don't have a problem with, and we as Christians do not have a problem with variants within our manuscripts. You have to know that these variants are going to occur. Why? Because they're written and copied by humans. Humans make mistakes. So when you try to say that the variants, we don't know who wrote the Gospels were written late, you can't trust them, or the copyists they change things. Again, you are going outside of scholarship. And I'm going to reference the biggest hero of Muslim apologists, Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, may Allah be pleased with him, says in his book, where is his book? I just had it out. Where did it go? As a matter of fact, I copied this from it earlier today. But listen to what he says in one of the appendixes of what was the book? Misquoting Jesus. Look what it says. When he's talking about Bruce Metzger. Bruce Metzger was one of the great New Testament scholars of the 20th century, and Bart was a student of his. And as a matter of fact, they co-authored a book together. And here's what he says about the differences between him and Bruce Metzger as far as what the New Testament is concerned. He says, we are in complete agreement on the number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original, this is important, the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement. Maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript edition of the New Testament. What he means by that, I think, is that even if 1 or 2 passages that are used to argue for a belief have different textual readings, there are still other passages that could be used to argue for the same belief. So Bart Ehrman, the hero of the Dalagandists, says that even taking into consideration all of these variants, there is no core Christian beliefs that are in jeopardy when we look at the variants. So if you're a Muslim and you're trying to say that the Bible has been corrupted, what you're going to have to do is you are going to have to locate a manuscript that predates Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, beginning in 50 AD and earlier. You're going to have to show us something prior to that predates those Gospels in order to show corruption. In order to show corruption, you first must look at the text that you have in your hand and then show that you have something different that changes the meaning of that text. If you cannot do that, you are making a specious argument. You might as well go to Disneyland and have a debate with people, because there you can create anything that you want to. But here, when you have to do scholarship, when you have to actually get down there and analyze what is said, instead of come up with these fluffy, flowery little arguments and cliches, it's not going to work anymore. The Christians have the information. They just have to use it.
Amen.
Amen.
Yeah, sorry, just for the audience, Nicodemus and someone else, I've updated the link on Google. For some reason, it wasn't open, so I've opened the link. I've sent you guys approval, and I've changed the link to be public for anyone who wants to download those documents. Links are in the description. Yeah, thank you, Eric. That was really good. I mean, that's great. Yeah, it just shows. I mean, we do have a strong case. We have the documents, and we have so many documents we can reconstruct. We've got so many sources that all corroborate the authenticity of the documents and the meaning and the preservation. Whereas Muslims somehow failed to preserve both the Injil, the Torah, the Zabur, and the Quran. How'd they do that? They don't
Right.
have copies of any one of them.
Um,
And the Quran confirms them all.
Again, if you wanted to get a copy of the presentation, Eric Theckefer at gmail.com, or you can, better yet, you can do this. You can go to my YouTube channel, the Crossing the Crescent discussion group, subscribe, and then get my email from there if you want to. The woman caught in adultery. What was the reference for the woman caught in adultery? There's been all kinds of scholarship. Christian scholars have known this for centuries, that the story of the woman caught in adultery does not appear in the earliest manuscripts. There is, I'm trying to think what the gentleman's name is. Well, he writes a defense of the inclusion of the woman caught in adultery as being authentic in the Gospel of John. I just cannot remember the guy's name. I read it earlier, but anyway, all of the earliest copies of the Gospel of John do not contain that story. As a matter of fact, the Diatessaron, which is the synthesis of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written by Tatian, does not have the woman caught in adultery, and that was written in 170 AD. So if you're, when we start looking at, how can you say one of the most beautiful stories in Christianity is actually not in the earliest manuscripts? Again, Papias, it's in the writings of Papias. Papias said that John had told him that this was a teaching of Jesus, or this is something that happened with Jesus. And, they just had to find a place to put it, and it ended up in the Gospel of John. As a matter of fact, I think it was in the Gospel of Luke at one time. I might be wrong on that, but it finally found a home in the Gospel of John.
I just released a video today. It's like 2 minutes long on Quran 11. I think it's Quran 11, 40 to 41, which speaks of Noah's fourth son. Right? And one has to wonder, I mean, do we have any references to Noah's fourth son in the Bible?
No.
No.
So where does the Quran get that Noah had 4 sons? The fourth son is called Yam. And unfortunately, so Yam dies in the flood. Yam refuses to become a Muslim and get on the ark, and he dies in the flood. And Yam happens to be the god of the flood, the god of water, and he's an enemy of the god Baal, and Baal defeats Yam. So it's very odd that the fourth son of Noah is a pagan god that is an enemy of Baal, which is really weird. So yeah, there's so everyone, it's a very short video. It's on my channel, released today, and you have to wonder, where does the Quran get this nonsense? I mean, this is a pagan god that somehow winds up as Noah's fourth son.
Well, this is exactly what this is consistent. That is exactly, that is consistent with what we find within the Quran itself. There are so many stories where the Quran has cited known heretical, Gnostic, apocryphal, Syriac folklore stories, and is passed off as somehow being divinely revealed to Muhammad by this sock puppet they call Gabriel. And it's I don't even know what type of apologetic that you could continue to come up with. When you start pointing these things out, you say, okay, for an example, we have from the Talmud, Midrash Sanhedrin 9.5, talking about, if you save one life, it says you saved all the world. If you
Yeah, Quran 532, 533, exactly, taken from the, yeah.
And it's almost, I mean, there's like 6 or 7 different points of congruence here. And how can you say that and we know that this was written prior to Quran, this existed prior to, it's like a 2nd or 3rd century document. How can you continue to say that that is divinely inspired? And the excuse, and here's the excuse is that, well, the rabbi who wrote that did not realize that they were writing something given to them directly. They were inspired by God to write that, and they did not know that. So therefore, Gabriel is ensuring that this teaching continues and is emphasized in the Quran. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm doing a series now on the fake preservation of the Quran, which Haitham Sidki called "Lies to Children." Right? I mean, you've got a PhD scholar saying that that is lies to children.
Right.
So, yeah.
Somebody made
Haitham Sidki.
Who?
Haitham Sidki. Haitham Sidki.
Yeah, I've been watching him lately.
Oh, hold on. Let me just bring it up quickly. It's on my channel. I'll just quickly play it. If I can find it, videos. Here we go. Let me just share my screen. I will play that, and then we should end because it's late and it's dinner time, and
Yes.
I haven't had dinner yet. But hold on. So, guys, yeah, just so you know, this one is called Noah's Fourth Son: Islamic Truth or Canaanite Myth, and it's 2 minutes 43 seconds. So you have time to watch it. This is Haitham Sidki, Quran Preservation. I'll play this one now. Did I share it? Let me share my screen again with audio. I need to share my screen with the audio. Yes, sharing the audio. Window, this one. Share screen, okay, hold on, yep. Fine, I'll just play this one. Am I sharing?
No.
You know, it's StreamYard is doing this to me again. For some reason, last time it did the very same. Let me do this again.
Drop down of different tabs that you have.
Now it's working, yeah. There's a little bug with me, and okay, let me play this one. 1 minute long.
At least within Sunni Islam, there's a general belief that the Quran, in it, from its at least within Sunni Islam, there's a general belief that the Quran, in it, from its origin, was multiformal, and what that means is that it was not one Quran, but there were many renditions, many versions of the Quran, and so different people have different conceptions as to where these variations come from. Is it, were they all uttered by the Prophet? Were some of them, did the Prophet, it's called Iqrar, did he hear them and he approved of them? Or were they generated by the companions, and so on and so forth? And unfortunately, actually, so I have heard some preachers that do say that there's only, one reading or one Quran or something like that. And, if I were to be very generous, I would say that falls under the umbrella of like lies to children, if that makes sense. That falls under the umbrella of like lies to children. That falls under the umbrella of like lies to children. That falls under the umbrella of like lies to children.
So he specializes in Quranic studies. He runs some sort of Quranic center. So the guy's like top scholar. So there you go. Just thought I'd show that.
Yeah, and that when we start talking about stories to children, I mean the seven sleepers of Ephesus or whatever that's called, that comes to mind. The Hoopty Bird and the Queen of Sheba.
All of that.
All that stuff,
Yeah, I've actually got a lot of notes. We can talk about those things another time. We can actually bring up some of those and discuss so we can plan. So, guys, yeah, we should call it a night. Connie, any words from you?
Yeah. Since Eric established academically the New Testament, I would encourage all the dear Muslims to start reading the New Testament. Thank you.
Great. Eric, final word?
Yeah, it's kind of spot on with that. A lot of times when you find the Muslims commenting on the Old Testament or the Bible, saying it's been corrupted, they can't, tell you, name 5 or 6 books of the Bible. This is the level of ignorance that is preyed upon in the Muslim community. You look at, I think the best illustration of this is that debate that David Wood had with Muhammad Hijab, however many years ago, where hijab is essentially lying through his teeth, trying to present things as fact when they're not. They're known lies, easily demonstrable lies.
Allah praise for Muhammad, not to Muhammad.
Well, and that was the biggest of them all. But who was, if you look and see the reaction of the crowd, it's like going to SeaWorld down in Florida and you're getting seals to clap if you just throw them a fish. Well, if you just throw them a lie, those clapping seals will sit there and Allah Akbar all day long without knowing the facts. And I would just echo what Connie said, is to do your own research, as Darcy always says on the show. Do your own research, read the Bible, and then try to make those claims with the knowledge, with known facts and knowledge, as opposed to what your imam is telling you.
Yeah, they're all about show. I mean, they're all about performance. They're not about fact. But the thing is, we are slowly pushing them back. I mean, they're losing ground. We've got the facts. And right now, they are having to tap dance big time. And I say we make them tap dance off the cliff. So...
yeah.
Thank you, Brother Lloyd.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Eric.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having us on your channel again, Lloyd. It's a lot of fun to come on here and not have to run a show. And actually,
great pleasure. Yeah, I mean, it's just good to listen and to learn. I learned a lot myself, and hopefully so did the audience. Their links are in the description, and please go to their channels, support them as well. This is fantastic work. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you, Connie, for coming. So yeah, guys, we can talk about coming back again and picking up this topic, perhaps because I've read the book that you had earlier, the one with the original sources of the Quran, and I mean, it's clearly a collection of stories, Gnostic fabrications, and there's two versions. There's the one called the original sources of Islam, which is the earlier one, I believe, which he actually retracted. He said it's got errors in it and it's incomplete. He then wrote a second one called the sources of the Quran. I think it's in that order. So if you've got the other one, check that that's not the one that he said you should stop using, because he's got the updated, improved one.
Yeah, I think there's two. There's two different publications.
Sources of Islam and sources of the Quran, and one of them he said you should.
How many different story? I went in and I
bookmarked. Wow.
Yeah, I booked. That's how many different stories that there are. Well, there's even more than that, but it's ridiculous.
No, it's fantastic. Yeah, so thank you very much, guys, and we'll be in touch. We'll definitely see you soon. And thank you. This was very enlightening. We learned a great deal.
Yeah,
and I look forward to having you guys back. Then I can kick back and just say, "Okay, Eric, I'm delegating you. Do everything."
The afternoons at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time here in Dar al Harb, Kafiristan. You can come across the Crescent discussion group, and you can just get back and enjoy anytime you want to.
Yeah, it's not safe for me to jump on your channel. You know what happens to your channel if I come on, right?
Yeah, that's right. It gets deleted, and I have to.
Oh, it's worth the risk, though.
Yeah, it would. I would love to have you back on. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go through your channel, and I'm going to look at some of those videos that you have in there, and pick a topic, and have you come on, and we'll have a discussion on that. Is that okay?
Yeah. By the way, yeah, fantastic. Yeah. And by the way, guys, Claire Lopez, you may or may not know her. She's a very senior professor. You know Claire Lopez, Eric?
Yes. She's used to be a CIA.
Analyst. She's very well known in the counterterrorism world as an analyst, as an expert, subject matter expert on the Middle East. I am having her on my channel on Friday.
So awesome.
The time is not optimal. Unfortunately, I couldn't have her on at the time I wanted. It's probably going to be at about 4:30 p.m. my time, which I think is about 10:30 a.m. your guys' time. Where you are in EST, it's about 10:30 a.m. EST, but that's the time slot that I have unless I move it. But yeah, so Claire Lopez is coming on. Someone introduced us. So yeah, they thought that we needed to talk. So yeah, someone who knows her. She's part of a group that I can't talk to because they meet at 1 a.m. in the morning, which is a bit late. So
yeah, well, she's definitely a treasure. That's for sure. Very, very knowledgeable on the threat.
Yeah. No. I bought the book Sharia, the Threat. And I read it, and I followed some of her work. I've read some of her articles. I was really interested in the Sharia, and she and her colleagues provided the very best coverage at the time of how the Muslim Brotherhood were operating, and that's interesting to me. And I've been doing a lot of work on my channel recently on the Muslim Brotherhood and Hajj Amin al-Husseini. I've made some short videos on that topic, something we need to explore. So these guys, I mean, the Palestinians were Nazis through and through. I mean, that's just a blunt fact. Palestine was a Nazi state, period. Simple. So guys, thank you very much. We'll see you next time. So everyone, good night and God bless.
Right, God bless you. Thank you for having us on, Lloyd.
Thank you, brothers.